And you guys are live.
Hello, welcome to the QuaranCon2022 2022 panel. It's very late here, okay, and I have been drinking a little bit. It is a Friday night. The World Building panel, where before we started, we talked about maybe setting up a swear jar for every time someone mentions Lord of the Rings or Wheel of Time. I'm assured there's not many Wheel of Time readers. Two of our panelists have read two of the books between them. I have read all 14 plus the prequel about 20 times. So it's a good job that I am just going to be asking the questions on this one. I am David Green. I am the author of the Empire of Ruin series and the Urban Fantasy Hell in Haven series. And I have a great panel of fantastic authors with us today. So we're going to be introducing ourselves in a little minute and talking about all things world building, the good, the bad, and how we go about it. And also, if you have any questions that people are watching, please put them in the comments and we'll get to them if we have time. We have just an hour, and obviously world building is such a huge topic. We even have someone on the panel who's written the book about world building, who is lifting his eyebrows right down there at the bottom. So without any further ado, enough of me rambling. Let's get to know our panelists. So Patricia, if we start with you, let everyone know your brilliance.
Hi, my name is Patricia A. Jackson. Everyone calls me Patty. I got my start in the Star Wars universe, but my debut novel came out in November 2021, and it's called Forging a Nightmare, and it's urban fantasy, and I'm just really tickled to be here to talk about world building because my favorite place to talk about is hell. I love to take mythology and break things, so I'm looking forward to hearing what the panelists have to say.
Excellent. We must talk later about Star Wars and hell because they're two of my favorite things. Gareth, I say I'm half Irish, you're full Irish. Tell everyone about yourself.
I'm Gareth Hanrahan, or Gareth Ryder Hanrahan, depending on how wide the spine of the book is. I'm indeed Irish, as far as I'm aware. I wrote, what did I write? Many things. I've written the Black Iron Legacy for Orbit Books. And with my other hat on, I write lots of role-playing game material, which is also world building adjacent. And yeah, that's me.
Excellent. Moving on. Andrea Stewart, please let everyone know all about yourself.
I'm Andrea Stewart, which you already said, but I am the author of the Drowning Empire trilogy. So the first two books are out. It's The Bone Shard Daughter and The Bone Shard Emperor. I also have a number of short stories out, which also involve a little bit of world building, but not nearly as in-depth as the novels.
Down at the bottom there, Matt, if you please would tell everyone about yourself.
Hi, I'm Matt. I write under the name MD Presley, and I'm a screenwriter, and I do, but best known for this little side project, Forging Fantasy Realms. It's a nonfiction series examining fantasy world building. So just breaking it down from the early theories of Tolkien, not saying Lord of the Rings, but his writings before fantasy was even a genre, it wasn't even named fantasy, like tracing it all the way through Jemison's current lectures on world building, looking at it that way. Also have a YouTube channel, Forging Fantasy Realms, because I'm not very creative when it comes to names, and where I break down world building tricks, tips, and techniques by building a world on the fly once a week.
And last, but definitely not least, down there, Daniel Stride, how are you doing today, sir? And let everyone know about yourself.
So hi there, I'm from Dunedin, New Zealand, on this bright sunny Dunedin morning, which is very untypical. I've got one novel out. I categorize it as steampunk flavored dark fantasy. It's called Wise Fool, Phuul. I'm in the process of writing a sequel for that. I've also written quite a few short stories, which are published online in various magazines. And I also run a blog called A Foolish Fellow, which tends to wind up talking a lot about Tolkien. Again, not Lord of the Rings.
So I'm going to take Tolkien as money into the swear jar. I'm afraid it just has to go. So we've had a few references already. So that's fine. You know, we're all very, very rich and successful authors. We can put loads of money into this swear jar. There's no bother about it whatsoever. So we've got some comments already. We've got QuaranCon saying that they're excited for this panel. You have to say that, QuaranCon. This is your panel. You have to say it. So I'm not taking that with any genuinity about it. But also Rachel Renner is here as well. Hello. She was just on the Bake Off, which was great fun if anyone was watching the Bake Off before. QuaranCon, there's lots of things going on. There's loads of great panels for the rest of today and going into the early hours of the morning, depending on where you are in the world. But also on the website, there is a fantastic book sale going on at the moment, which many of us will have books involved. So please do check that out. There's lots of free books. There's books for 99 cents. Please do check those out and support the authors that you like, and maybe that you don't even know yet, which would be nice. So let's get into world building. So I'm going to start off with you, Patricia, and we'll work our way around. QuaranCon says it was sincere. We'll see about that by the end of the hour. We'll see how excited you really were. Patricia.
You're not taunt the con.
What we want to talk about first is obviously we're going to get into the nitty gritty of world building, but just to kind of warm up, we can talk about what examples of good or great world building that you have come across, and maybe some that are not so good, if anything stands out to you. And by all means, in the good side and the excellent side, you can maybe talk about your own work as well.
Excellent examples of world building, I would have to say, is Robin McKinley. Her books, The Hero and the Crown and The Blue Sword, were just examples. I have a short attention span, and authors who have a tendency to go on and on and on with their description, I start skipping, and they lose me. Thomas Hardy, that's not fantasy sci-fi, but that's literature. His book, Return of the Native, was terrible. 25 pages of a meadow. Yeah, you're killing me. So when you have an author go on and on for 2 pages about how someone is dressed or how the characters change their dress every time the scene changes, I'm just not interested. There's a mummy over there. There is the pyramid. Don't tell me what dynasty it is. I don't care. Tell me what weapons we're carrying and how we're getting underground to the mummy to go and take care of it. So those are my examples. Robin McKinley is an excellent one. Another one is Susan Dexter, who did the War Horse of Estragon.
Would you say the style has changed a little bit? Because what you were talking about there about the more descriptive parts of world building, would you say that's more like of a classical approach to it, whereas now these days it's more of a organic kind of, let's just fit in and sprinkle this in a little bit here?
Yes, definitely. I guess I'm going to owe money in the swear jar because I'm going to mention Lord of the Rings. As a kid, I didn't have all these distractions, like the kids do today with social media and whatnot. So I could really fully immerse myself in that. Now, as an adult, with all the distractions that are available to me, it's a tough read. That's a real long slog for me. So yeah, it is a classical style. It has its purpose for those who enjoy that kind of thing, but my life's a little too fast for that now.
I'll presume that you skip the poetry when it gets to the poetry and the songs.
No, because I'm a completionist too. That's probably what my problem is.
Yeah, I am a completionist too. Pro poetry and songs in our literature. Let's go for it. Gareth, same question to you. Good examples, maybe not so great examples.
I'm going to be really pretentious and say, well, the good and bad example is the real world. Like if you like, look, a friend of mine always says, like, start with Earth when coming to any sort of episode of world building, which is great advice. But the issue with the real world is that it is far, far too complicated for any one reader to understand. So when you're creating your own novel, you've got to sort of, pick and choose the relevant bits and the bits that will support your story, while also maintaining a level of consistency and realism, and supporting the bits you use. So basically, the real world is the best example to take for world building, but also the author that is far too detailed.
And is that an approach that you would take for your own work? And that is kind of the things that matter to the story that's being told?
Yeah, I mean, I would always sort of distinguish between world building for the sake of world building and world building to support the story. And you start off with a world building to support the story, and then if you have time, space, interest, and can justify it, you go off and do the fun stuff.
Okay, Andrea, same question to you, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to give one example of each so we don't drag this out, but I really enjoyed the world building in Fondalee's Jade City, and then the Green Bone Saga. That's the name of the trilogy. But I found that the way that she trickled in information to be really immersive. I remember there's this one scene where there were these two characters who go to this hole-in-the-wall restaurant, and the details that she picks out make it feel really real, and then also kind of give you a sense of what the world is like. And she's also doing something really a little bit more unusual in the sense that it is kind of like a modern society, but there is magic and it's kind of this alternate world. So there's like a lot of stuff to explain, but she kind of brings it in at the point at which it's really relevant for the reader. So I thought that was just very, very well done, very elegantly done. For a bad example, I don't want to name names or anything, but I do remember I read a book that had this really interesting premise, but they didn't really follow through with how it affected everybody in their everyday lives. So I was really pulled in by this premise, but then I didn't really see it having any effect on the way that the people thought and the way that they lived and the way that they went about their daily tasks. So that to me was kind of a failure of world building. Right.
So you would say that it was not really affecting the characters in any kind of way, shape, or form. It was just purely just dressing for the...
Right. Like there was like maybe one scene that I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool and interesting. And then it's like never brought up again. I'm like, well, if this was really a factor in somebody's world, then this would be something that's like constantly affecting the way that people think and the way that they behave, and it was not. So I kind of like forgot that was even a thing in this world. So I think that's really important, is like the consistency, basically.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, excellent point. Matt, let's move on to you.
Well, it's funny. I actually try to. Well, actually, I'll do a bad one, and I will name names. Like I've got a kid, and so I have to read a lot of stories. And reading Richard Scarry's books, I don't know, like from the 50s America, and some of the things are really good in it. It's very progressive. Like, you know, you can be a dad and just be a dad, and like you don't have to like jobs. It's some of it's really great, but anthropomorphic animals, it annoys the crud out of me, because then they're like, oh yeah, there's a bear who lives here, and you know, the world building isn't thought out. It isn't, you know, like they just live like normal society that we do. That's bad world building. Like if you're evolved from bears, you wouldn't live like us. And I know it's a children's book, which is why I'm picking on it. And he's been dead for forever, so I don't feel bad. So that's bad world building. They have a premise that they're not exploring all the way. Good world building, I try to use effective versus ineffective world building. Like good world building, there's a huge scale of what that is. Like if you don't notice it, that's good world building. That's effective world building, because it played its part in the story seamlessly. So that's a good thing. And then you can stop and go, man, that was a really cool scene right there. You know, that was a really cool image that you gave me of this world. Like you can stop and admire it. That's also good world building. I use exemplars in my books, and part of it's because they're so ubiquitous. And Lord of the Rings, I'll put $1 in, you know, Star Wars, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, and Avatar: Last Airbender are ones that I call them inspired world building, because the world is so rich that there's multiple stories and different timelines in the world. And some of them have theme parks. Like people love the world building so much they want to go to it. They visit the scenes where Lord of the Rings was filmed, that kind of stuff. So those are the ones that I use as all my examples because they are ubiquitous. My mom doesn't read fantasy. She knows what a hobbit is. So it's integrated with culture, with pop culture. So those are really easy ones to hold up to say this is great world building. Yeah, so I'll stand by those despite the $1 I had to put in to, yeah.
Well, we didn't say $1. It could have been $50. So I didn't come up with a price yet. I'm going to reveal it at the end of the how much you all owe. It's one of the things and you touched on it there, was about these worlds, that there's so many different stories and tales going on in different corners of it. And I was on a panel for a different con last year, and it was about what happens when the story is over. And something I was kind of touching on was, if a world is built in such a great way, that only because that story is over in that particular book or series doesn't mean that there's not other stories to tell over here. And that is the sign of a really well-developed world. So I'm glad that you pointed those ones out, because those are the ones that have lived on, and that then there's still these stories being told all the time, right?
Just 30-second add on to that. There's a textbook of world building, Mark J.P. Wolf, Building Something Imaginary Worlds. Anyways, he points out one of the 4 C's is completeness, and that's the sense the world existed before the story is taking place. There are parts that are not explored in it, and it will exist afterwards. And so, yeah, that's a vivid, living world and something to aim for, kind of thing. Sorry.
No problem. Dan, let's finish off with you on this question.
Okay, so apart from he who shall not be named, we've also got, one example of very impressive world building I recall, is, this is going a little bit far back, is Brian Aldiss's Heliconia science fiction series. Essentially, it posits a planet in orbit around a binary star system, and over the series of books, we for instance get sort of set in winter, summer, or spring, and the world in question just absolutely changes in accordance with that, which I've always found very, very impressive. And dare I say it, while I thoroughly like A Song of Ice and Fire, one criticism of it I would have is that I feel like the seasonal thing is treated very much as a backdrop for plot purposes rather than an organic part of the world. Because, honestly, if you had 10-year winters or 10-year summers, why would we have sort of basically medieval feudalism developing rather than something rather more alien? But yeah, so just sort of compare and contrast the examples of dealing with multi-year seasons. Other sort of another good example of world building I can think of is Scott Baker's Prince of Nothing series. It's going back a while. I thoroughly enjoyed the philosophical underpinnings of it. And again, although this is probably quite controversial, I am honest. The early Harry Potter books, in terms of world building, the world building there is fine because it doesn't actually matter. It's when Rowling tries to essentially graft an adult world onto something very whimsical. I feel it doesn't exactly. I feel the result falls flat, unfortunately.
It's funny, before you mentioned as well, science. You had a science fiction example there at the start.
Yeah.
Is the approach, and just briefly on this one, we could talk about this one for the whole hour, I'd imagine. Is the approach to world building for science fiction inherently different, in your opinion, to fantasy? Is there different rules to it, or is it consistent across both of them?
I would suggest that they are kind of the same thing, though. It fundamentally depends on the nature of the story. There are plenty of science fiction stories which simply aren't about the world. They're about the underlying ideas or characters or what have you. And it's much the same with fantasy. But yeah.
Okay, so Patricia, back to you. We will get into the next question. So we'll talk more a little bit about your own experience in writing and introducing world building into your work. And you've all mentioned it a little bit there about the description, but the thing that I kind of really want to look into is info dumping, because one of the series that would get some money into well, actually probably both of the series that would get some money into the swear jar both have instances of, I'm a character that's going to tell you a story about this world, and you're going to sit there and listen for about 4 paragraphs while I tell you this story about something that happened 1,000 years ago. And that has kind of changed these days. People don't really want to sit through and read that. So how do you go about avoiding the info dump when you are trying to get across your world building?
I think you said it at the beginning of the panel when you were talking to someone. You talked about letting it happen organically. As writers, you get super excited about sharing your world, and your characters are super excited to tell the story. So you want to dump all of this interesting richness into the world, and that's where your info dumping comes, because you want to do it in the first chapter or in the second chapter instead of building it throughout. And I always talk about the inner 8-year-old. That's my inspiration, my creative spark. And I'm like, shh, what do we need for this moment in the scene? What do we need to tell the reader and the character about what's going on? So we slow things down, slow the scene down. I'm very cinematic when I do my writing. So what is it that you need right now? You need one poisonous flower, not the entire flora and fauna of the world, just one poisonous flower. So let's talk about that and how it interacts with the world and the character.
You've obviously worked in the Star Wars universe as well. So how did you go about bringing in elements from something that's been going on for, what, 50 years now at this point almost? How do you go about interweaving that into what you're doing?
It was always my belief that when the Death Star blew up, there were other stories going on. Somebody was having a baby. Somebody was burying their spouse of 40 years. So those were the stories that I really wanted to tell. And it was just happening within a Star Wars framework. I tend to go left and off the rails with most things. Someone says, you're going to write this fantasy story and you're going to talk about medieval legend. I'm going to take as far a left turn as I possibly can so I can follow my own rules. So you have a story to tell. You're just putting it in the framework of Tolkien or Star Wars, whatever it might be, and you just have fun with it from there.
Gareth, same question to you. What is your process when you are getting information across to the reader about the world that you've created?
Yeah, I mean, to make a Patty, to a degree, it's a question of finding the right moment. That, like, you have to. The info dumping has to serve the story. You can't have a character like wander across the field and spend 2 paragraphs talking about the bizarre biology of the world or whatever, or like looking at a castle and going, I will now stop here and expound to myself the history of this particular castle. To defend Tolkien, and I'll throw a coin in there. He does a lot of his info dumping quite carefully. The first chapter of Lord of the Rings is the long expected party, where you've got lots of world building but very little info dumping. You don't sort of stop and get a lengthy biography of Bilbo Baggins or anything. But then you've got the Shadow of the Past, which is a chapter entirely of info dumping, where Gandalf comes and says, "Here is the plot." And what Tolkien does carefully is he makes you interested in it. You are now have enough questions that you want answered, and you have this avuncular mentor coming along going, I will now answer the questions and give you context for what's going on. There's a bit in Jeff Vandermeer's Wonder Book, which I seem to plug at every panel, which is a book on writing science fiction fantasy stories. And there's a side panel or a sidebar from Kim Stanley Robinson about world building and info dumping. And he makes a fantastic argument that as long as you make the info dumping interesting, your reader will go along with it. So basically, you need to sort of question the readers, and essentially they want to find out what's going on. They want to know more about the world, and then you set up a situation where there's some character who can explain in a reasonable context the information they need to know at that point.
That's a great point. And I was going to ask a follow-up question for everyone about that point. So remind me after we finish this one, we'll circle back round to good info dumping, I suppose, is the way to do it. And anyone who's watching, let us know some examples of world building that you enjoy as well. Pop them into the comments, and we can, we'll see if any of the panel share the same opinion as you. Andrea, when you're approaching giving information to readers, what's your thoughts on that?
So I think of it generally as a couple of things, like efficiency. So is my writing being efficient? So as far as like, I think, there's three things that we try to reveal in a writing, and that's the character, the setting, and the plot. So the more that you can reveal those things at the same time, I think the more that the world building begins to feel a little bit more natural. So, for example, like one of the things that I always like to use are like world relevant metaphors from the character's point of view. So something that they would use that makes sense in the world, but also makes sense for the character, can reveal a lot about your character as well as the world. Sometimes you can fit like all three things in like one sentence, and it's amazing. But I feel like then it feels a lot less info dumpy and more like a natural flow of things. And then as far as like a natural flow, I think another thing is kind of like breadcrumbs as far as world building goes, where you are setting things up with for the reader to ask themselves questions like, oh, what is this? Where you can mention something at the beginning of the story that you may not answer that question until a little farther on. And I think part of that is kind of understanding the rhythm of your story and knowing when is the right time to answer that question, so it doesn't feel like it's like too soon, because if it's too soon, then I think it starts to feel info dumpy. If it's too late, then your reader's kind of like confused. So I think with world building, a lot of times it's like this series of questions and answers. Another thing that Patricia was mentioning about writers getting excited about putting all the info out there. Another way that I had heard it described before was defensive world building, is one of my friends described it this way, where you're like, oh gosh, like I have to put this info in here, otherwise the reader won't understand what's going on. I think that you really do have to give your reader a little bit more credit than that. And I think it's the instinct is to over explain, but I think that you often can get away with explaining a lot less than what you think you need to.
Sure, yeah. And you mentioned something about breadcrumbs as well. And I should have actually mentioned Star Wars as one of the things that we have to put in the swear jar as well. I can't retroactively do that, because that would be unfair to Patricia as well, because it would be like, well, but one of the things that I always remember about world building from Star Wars, and I've started watching it with my son recently. He's only 4, but he sees Star Wars around, and we were at Disneyland and he saw all the Star Wars stuff and he knows the characters. So we watched the first movie and he loved it as well. He loved it. But that line from Obi-Wan Kenobi, when he talks about the Clone Wars, he mentions the Clone Wars. It's just one line, and that was it. One mention in the first 3 films. But it's one of those things that's like, well, I remember when before the prequels came out, because I'm of that vintage, and I was like, what were the Clone Wars? And then when the prequels were announced, they're like, we're going to see the Clone Wars. What are they? And I was so excited about that, because from this one line from a film from 1977 that we're finally going to get the answer to. So that was a great point. I love a bit of breadcrumbing myself. Matt, I hope you've brought enough popcorn for all of us. I see you munching down on it.
So my son is watching WALL-E for the second time in 2 days right now as this is going on. That's how I'm buying myself this time. So he has popcorn, so I bought myself. And I was hoping that an argument would break out so I could just...
No
arguments. My prop comedy did not work out.
Let's hope there is an argument. Everyone loves a good argument on a panel. Who doesn't love it? Matt, some from your point of view, from a certain point of view, getting the information across to people as to a reader. We've had some great points so far about being organic, breadcrumbs, trusting the reader to understand what it is that you're doing without holding the hands all the time. What else have you kind of got to add to this so far?
Well, to piggyback on the don't hold their hands, like in screenwriting, producers think audiences are idiots and always like, well, are they really going to understand this? Like, yes, give them some credit. Like they've been with us for 40 minutes at this point. Let them, like, don't spell out what the bad guy is doing. Don't have like, oh, I'm doing this for my mom, like 40 minutes in. Like, we know that, we've seen it. Like, trust your reader, trust them. Anyways, I fight against that a lot. So to piggyback off of what everyone else has been saying, Gareth kind of mentioned was basically Inside Out. Well, one thing is audiences, and this is borrowed from role-playing games, care about they care about world building as it pertains to this one gaming session. And as the gaming goes on and on, then I'm going to care about more about the world. But why do I care about the lineage of the king when I'm trying to clear out this dungeon of goblins? Now, later, when I find out that the king's wars have displaced the goblins and brought them there, like, 7 sessions in, I'm going to want to know about the king. So, we as writers want to just throw all this wonderful information, this living world that we've created at people. They don't want it. You have to build the equity. Sanderson calls it info dump equity, where they want this information. And like The Matrix is one of the most egregious info dumps of all times. It's a 7-minute scene where he literally sits Neo down and says, this is like, he tells, not shows. Like, it breaks all the rules, but it works because it's 40 minutes in and they've been hinting at it. They've been breadcrumbing it. And so when they finally sit down and tell the audience through Neo what the movie is about, like, we want it. Like, we have been craving this for 40 minutes and we will sit down for 7 minutes to listen to it. So info dump equity, the people have to want the information more than, than the time is taken of the information itself. And so that's also my answer for good info dump. Info dumps aren't bad. They're just a tool like anything else. You can use it well. Tolkien, I think he has like 2 chapters in Lord of the Rings, like boom, info dump. Like I can barely get through them.
Right.
Swear jar. Sorry, twice.
They're right at the very start as well. But there's one example, and it comes from movies, I think, and you reminded me with The Matrix there about it's kind of how Anne Sanderson talks about info dump equity. Inception, the first half of the movie is essentially an info dump that goes, these are the rules of the world that we have made here. I'm going to tell you how this movie is going to work for the second half of the movie, which he tries to do, Christopher Nolan tried to do again in Tenet, but it didn't work quite as well because there was some bits where it was like, this is too much. But however it was he went about it in Inception, it worked because we were like, okay, yeah, I think it might just because it was about dreams and people are just naturally interested in dreams and how dreams work because we all have them and we all experience them. But it was funny how you mentioned that because the Matrix, it is that tease and that breadcrumb, and then it's like, come on, tell us the answers. Whereas Inception, it's the other way around. It's like, we're going to tell you how this movie is going to work so you can enjoy the second half of this movie as we want you to. Dan, how do you get this information across to your characters, to your readers?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I mean, what makes fantasy is that there is weird stuff going on relative to our mundane world. As such, I like to try and sort of show the weird stuff in action as early, preferably opening as I possibly can. I mean, for instance, in both my novel and in the sequel I'm currently writing, they're set in a world where necromancy is where necromancy is a universal ability. Essentially, they've got the undead sort of staffing all the mundane jobs. So essentially, in both situations, I literally just open with our protagonist interacting with interacting with the undead in a perfectly mundane setting. Which tries to emphasise the fact that this something weird is indeed going on. I would fully agree with the point that other people are making that info dumps aren't necessarily bad. As far as the exposition and dialogue goes, I mean, of course, the danger there is what TV tropes fictionally called the "as you know, Bob" situation, where characters wind up talking about things that both of them know already, which people don't really tend to do in real life. So one thing one caveat I would point out to that, I suggest people tend to point out stuff that they actually know and the other person knows in a situation where the character is angry. So that's arguably a situation where it would feel more organic to state known facts. But yes. So that was just my thoughts.
Excellent. I'm a big fan of the weird being married with the mundane. I think it's one of my favorite things in everything. I love it. So I will definitely check that out, because I would like necromancy being used in mundane matters. It sounds fantastic. So just to talk about the info dump, just quickly, we'll just throw this open to anyone who has any thoughts on it. You've all mentioned that there is a time and a place for it. When is the best place to do an info dump? Because we've had a few different kind of answers there. Well, maybe not too early, maybe not too late. What do you all think about it? And just feel free to jump in and educate me, please, because I would like to know.
All right, sorry. This is because I've been arguing. I had this argument this morning, so I really want to jump on this one. It is right at the break to the second act, using screenwriting, because like Hero's Journey, all of that. They've been given the mystery. They've seen the weird stuff. Neo, let's use that. Like, he's seen the weird stuff. He's resisted the call to action, and he's finally invested. He has left the Matrix into the new world. Boom! This is the time to sit him down and say, "Here are the rules." And then you can have fun with the rules for a while. And then they're going to get worse. Then, the midpoint's going to happen, and then things are going to get bad. But like, it is hardwired for, here's the info dump, like right here. So personally speaking, I've had a very long hour argument about this morning, this is where this information has to be. And that is why. So I'm muting myself.
Who wants to argue with Matt? Because he has the popcorn, so someone argue with him or agree with him.
I'm not arguing with him, but I think the interesting thing about writing is that there are rules, but then there are no rules. So I think, like, basically wherever you can get away with it, you can info dump. And this is why beta readers and editors are so great, because they'll tell you if you're not getting away with it. But yeah, sometimes, like, people say that you shouldn't put an info dump at the beginning, etc. I have read books that have had an info dump at the beginning. I don't know if any of you have read Kushiel's Dart, but it's basically like she just sits down and she's like, "Hey, this is me. This is what I'm about. And this is my childhood." And you're just like along for the ride because it's so well written. And the voice of the character is so strong. So I think it's like basically wherever you can get away with it.
I can say where not to put it. Not in the middle of a battle. Not in the middle of the chase. I'm in the middle of this wonderful battle. There's something going on, and some character wants to go waxing philosophical. Yeah, I'm not feeling that at all. I think if you're going to call it the info dump or the equitable info dump, a point of discovery. The character is lost along the way, and some mentor character comes along and says, "Stupid, you just got off the tracks, get back on. Here's a map, get back on." And maybe a little bit of info dumping at that point. I'm going to fight with Matt. I'm always, get your popcorn. I'm always enthralled by people who talk about the acts, because I am a feral pantser. I don't think about acts. I think about what happens next, what happens next, what happens next. So I think that those little info dumps can come at the points of discovery where, again, your characters have gotten off the beaten path and you have to get them back on. Sort of like role-playing, the NPC.
I like it. Your point there about info dumps in the middle of fighting and battles. I had a cough in my throat and it sounded like Steven Erickson. Just saying that. But moving on to the next point, we've got a couple of questions we want to try and get off, and we've got about 20 minutes left. So I think we have enough time. We're doing good. We're doing well. Let's give ourselves a little applause so far for what we're doing. So creating your world building, and we'll start with you, Patricia. And you just mentioned, I think you mentioned that you're a pantser there as well. So this will be interesting because we'll get to see, who's the outliner, who's the pantser as well. And when do you start to really think about the world building? So for example, for me, is that I'll have like a loose idea of what this world is that I've created. I'll get the story and the characters down first, and then I'll go back into the draft and go, right, what's important to this character? This character is this. So let's build this out here and have files and files and files and files and documents of all this stuff that no one will ever see in my lifetime, and probably theirs, and probably everyone else's lifetime too. It's all on my hard drive and no one will ever see it, but it's there. So how about you? When do you start with your world building?
I used to be like that. I used to write 700-page outlines for novels, but then I was done. There was no writing a novel because it's already written in an outline, and I could not convince my inner spark to go ahead and write the novel. It's written, it's outline form, but it's written. So where I like to go is, I don't like to make up my own stuff sometimes because I get lost in those circles and I can't get myself out of it. And it's like you said, you have world building upon world building, but no one's ever going to see it, but you do know. So I like to take what exists and break it. Like for instance, in my book, Forging a Nightmare, there's a place called the Vestibule Road. And I stole that directly from Dante Alighieri. You have the vestibule of the Inferno where you have unclassified souls. They're the losers, they're the suckers. They don't have a place. Heaven doesn't want them. Hell doesn't want them because they're losers. And I thought, how cool if you made that like standing in the line at Starbucks in the morning. It's just this endless road that there are no turns, and that's hell. You're just walking along this road. So then how cool would it be if you had this creature, a nightmare, an infernal warhorse that could see the different kinds of roads. And the only way to navigate that road was with one of these nightmares. And it just builds from there. Well, where did nightmare come from? Oh, they're forged from condemned human souls. Well, how is that done then? And it's like I said, the creative spark, the inner 8-year-old, well, how does that happen? Why is the sky that color? And how do you do that? And answering all those questions just keeps the pantser going. And that's where the world building just grows out of it organically as I go along. Now, I've been good and recorded all of those things so that I can go reference it for myself. I have my own little Jackson compendium. Well, what are the rules of that world when you go to that particular circle of hell? But that's how it unfolds for me.
The inner 8-year-old, what I've learned from this is that I have a 4-year-old who his favorite word is why, and what is his second favorite, and then train is his third favorite. But anyway, so I need to get him next to me when I'm writing stuff so he can ask me all these questions. So I can be like, that's a good question. Why is it like this? Gareth, with you, how do you, where does the world building come into it in during your process?
What I tend to do is I'll start with like 3 or 4 ideas I want to play with, which will normally be like either like random ideas I've had or stuff I've grabbed from history or just like things I want to write about. And then as I sit in the story, and then I work out what needs to sort of be put in there to buttress them. Like if I want to do a story that's set at a theatre, and when you're acting a plays or some of the spirits of the dead, just like round out the cast or something, I go, right, I need a world which has is like civilized and sophisticated enough to have theatres. I want to have a sort of I've been like reading lots of books on like 18th century British theatre, so I want a world that like it was like roughly the same level of like trade and commerce and etiquette and so forth. So I'll throw in stuff that will support that, and then I'll think, well, okay, if they can call up the dead for theatrical performances, where else can they call up the dead? What how has that affected society? How has that affected people's relationships with the afterlife? Basically, start with the cool stuff I want to write about, and then stick in stuff to support that later on.
Right. How much detail do you go inside, like behind the scenes? Is it just to serve the story that you're talking? I know you mentioned that before earlier on, that a lot of your world building and what you like is stuff that serves the story, or is there a more depth to it behind that, you know, people would not see, but it exists?
There's certainly the illusion of that depth. Because I do a lot of my stuff with role-playing games, I'm good at sort of taking throwaway details and working them into the plot, or coming up with justifications after the fact that look plausible. So I won't do that much research or conscious world building up until the moment, but I'm fairly good at sort of throwing up a fake wall and people think it's world bearing.
Yeah, the tradesman approach to things. That's the way.
Absolutely, I'm very, very lazy.
Excellent. Andrea, same with you, please.
I kind of feel like I do it simultaneously along with a few things. So I tend to think of the world building at the same time as I'm thinking about the characters, and also like I usually try to write a little bit of like the first few chapters just to kind of get the vibe of the story and like solidify what I want the world to feel like, and smell like, and look like. I'm a little bit chaotic that way, but I do a little bit like what Gareth talks about, where I do think about like, well, what are the really interesting things about my world that are different from maybe the way that our world is? And then I think about how does that carry through in the plot and in the characters and how people live their lives. So for example, in my Drowning Empire trilogy, they live on this archipelago of migratory islands, and the islands move around, which means that they have to have these navigators that can actually still navigate these islands because they move with the seasons. So there's this complicated set of calculations that they have to do in order to be able to figure out where the island is going to be specifically and how to get there. So I kind of think about it like that, like, well, how is this going to affect the characters, and how is this going to affect the way that people live? And as far as like details, I usually write up a document about like, oh, like this is like the basic economy of this world or these countries. These are the regions. This is their weather, you know, that kind of thing. Like these are the stories that people tell each other, like these are their legends. And then I just go from there. I try to keep like a wiki of like, oh, this is like, okay, this is like some of the words that they use like this language, or these are the names of the islands, because I'm sure that most authors have had that experience where you like name something and then you're like, oh crap, like what was the name of that thing? And then you're doing like a word search of like, I think this is what I was writing at the time. Let me try to find it. It's so inefficient. My only problem is that I'm like terrible about updating my wiki. So it's like a work in progress constantly. Yeah, that's kind of like how I start world building. I'm like doing that right now because I'm trying to write a new series or get the ideas off the ground. And yeah, it's chaotic, I would say.
Excellent. I worked on a shared project with someone once. I thought my kind of like note taking and documentation was quite high level, and this person created a private wiki for everything, and I was like, this is hardcore. I have to. This is next level, and it's way above what I would do. But and he's like, have you updated the wiki for this when you've done this? And I was like, no, I haven't, and I have no intention of doing it either.
I would recommend the wiki over a Word document just because I feel like it's a little easier to navigate and find things. But
yeah, that is true. That is true. Patty, just before we go on to Matt, you're getting a lot of kindred spirits in the comments, by the way. There's a lot of people that are like, yes, I completely understand what you're saying about all this. Matt, let's go to you.
I actually have, it sounds like what a lot of us are talking about is like the top down versus the bottom up, world building, which is, plotter, a planner or a, pantser. And I personally am very top down. I plan it all out ahead. My own fantasy series, it was a thought experiment. I created the world. just didn't have anything to do with it until one day a character that I had shelved from another project was like, oh, that would really work. And then it all came together. So, you can put it aside. And then I wrote a 100-page outline, character arcs, everything ahead of time. Part of that's the screenwriting background. You have to be structured in a screenplay. You can't figure this stuff out. It's so, you have to do it. It's like a sonnet, but not as pretentious. But still, you have to get this information out, and you have to do it in 120 pages. And this is where, so big fan of structure and that kind of thing. But the bottom up, I don't think that it should be ignored. The Gareth style, Patty style, discoverability. That's one of the things when I build a world on the fly. I just grab some ideas out of a bucket, a literal bucket that's sitting over there, and I build a world out of it. Because just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean you shouldn't be good at the other thing. Because even the most top-down person is going to hit a detail they didn't plan, and they need to be able to roll with it. And I think that a lot of it comes from my screenwriting background, because I'm writing other people's stuff. So they're like, hey, I want to do this with this actor, and then, and there's going to be a mountain in it, and the mountain's going to break. Like, okay, let's figure that out. Let's make some rules for that. And so you apply antecedents of well, why did this happen? So top down, bottom up, you got to have both of them, and try to use both of them as much as possible, because it keeps you sane. Because even if you're a bottom up person, I've written something, it's now canon in the story. I have to now subscribe to those rules. So I should have a wiki, so I remember the rules to my hell, that kind of thing. So yeah, both things.
Bottoms down. I did not think we would hear those phrases so often in this panel in such a short amount of time. Thank you, Matt. Dan, on to you.
Okay, one approach I'm quite fond of is essentially sort of you coming up with the idea for the rules of the world, and then essentially trying to break them. It's essentially, where could this go wrong, and essentially try to design, before the world even exists, design a system to try and prevent that happening. But that's sort of at a very sort of that's a very sort of high level. I also am particularly, this is purely a matter of personal interest for me. I mean, I personally find economics of invented worlds to be very interesting. So essentially, to take the necromancy example, I was particularly keen on exploring how a system where necromancy exists, it's taught in schools or what have you, impacts on the economic development of a given society. But that's purely a matter of sort of my personal interest. I understand that lots of other people don't find the subject quite so interesting. In terms of actual sort of writing, I am far more of a pantser. So I do kind of just in terms of the actual plot. So and you will invariably discover things that you basically didn't know about your world, and honestly, that's actually one of the charms of writing, from my experience.
Excellent. Rachel Renner says, "Pantsers unite." So there's a few people involved. So we'll move on to the final question, and then we'll see if we can tie this up before our time is over. Our time is coming to an end. Unfortunately, it's been a great panel. So world building, Patricia. Obviously, you don't come across a lot of fantasy readers or writers and sci-fi ones that say they don't like world building. But just how is it essential to a fantasy story, and why? And is the illusion of world building enough sometimes, as we've touched upon a little bit here, the bottom up kind of way? As long as it feels real, I suppose, and it's like a fake wall, as Gareth said it, is that enough sometimes, or does it have to be a bit more robust?
I'm a high school teacher that has been teaching in a pandemic for 2 years. So if you do not land the Millennium Falcon at the front page, I'm gone. If the dragon's not there, if the unicorn's not there, I'm not staying. If you had told me 5 years ago I was going to write an urban fantasy, I would have laughed at you, because I love high fantasy. I need to be taken away from my world, and I need to recognize some things to remind me that I have to go back and do adulting, but I need to step through that portal and be gone. So very, very, very important to me as a writer and as a reader for my therapy.
Gareth, same question to you, please.
Showing the level of tension I put in, there's an MJ Harrison essay, which I should have reread before to this panel, where he basically argues that world building is impossible, that it's always illusion, you're always just writing a story, and anyone who talks about an invented world is deluding themselves, which I don't agree with, but I see his point in that you can never build an actual world that will stand up to full scrutiny. All you can do is support the bits the reader look at closely and use sleight of hand, or just elide over the parts where there are gaps. If you push on any part of the world too heavily, it will fall apart. Because again, the author doesn't know everything and can't convey the supporting information for every aspect of it. So yeah, I'm not sure if it made sense, but it's nearly midnight here, so move on.
J.R.R. Tolkien has got words for you, and he wants them very soon.
I could talk about Tolkien's world building with the entire concept I want.
Well, we'll leave that for another time. We have 3 minutes left. Andrea, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Gareth says has some truth to it, but I also feel like it's like the set on a musical where it may just give the impression of something, but it enhances that immersion. And for me, I think that's a lot of the reason of why I read a fantasy or a sci-fi, is I want to be taken away to another place, and I want to feel like I'm there, and I want that sense of wonder. Like that's that incredible feeling you get like when, okay, I'm going to mention Tolkien. So, you're watching like Lord of the Rings and you see like these enormous statues of the waterfall. And like, you may not know exactly why they're there at that moment in time, but it makes you feel like there's a history and a background, even though, yes, okay, so Tolkien may have written a whole history and a background, but I don't think that you necessarily have to in order to have effective world building. Awesome.
Matt, you're deep in thought.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm just trying to figure how I can get it in a minute. This is actually chapter 2 of my book about it. And short answer, yes, it's necessary. It is the genre conceit. You read thrillers to be thrilled, romances to feel romance. I maintain that science fiction and fantasy, you do it to see the impossible. You're there to see, the Star Trek said, to seek out new life and new civilizations. Like that's what those two subgenres do. Oh, sorry, those two genres do. They just do it in different ways. And short answer, boom.
Excellent, thank you, Dan. To wrap us up.
So your fantasy and science fiction, I just noted down. It essentially it requires something weird going on. Exactly the level of that weird is might be up for debate. I mean, it suddenly occurred to me. I mean, there's no overt magic in for example, Gormenghast yet. People do consider that to be fantasy, just on a case of the setting alone. Also, it's really a case of just establishing what the weird stuff can and cannot do within the context of trying to resolve the plot.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for coming onto the panel. Thank you for everyone watching. Rachel Randall wants to know how much is in the jar. It was $250 per mention. We're all going to be sending our PayPal money through to QuaranCon as soon as we finish. QuaranCon are going to be so rich. Thank you for everyone from myself, Patricia, Gareth, Andrea, Matt, and Dan. Please check out the website, check out everyone's profiles on there, check out everyone's work, check out the store, and thank you for coming on to the World Building panel, and we will see you all again very, very soon. Thank you.